Imagine being told, by the people who run your country, that your voice is too sharp, your ambition too loud, your gender too inconvenient, and then deciding to change the law anyway. Not in a novel, in Parliament, with the clock already ticking on your life. Barbara Castle enters this story not as a symbol, but as a problem. At least, that's how the establishment would come to see her. She was born on 6 October 1910 in Chesterfield, Derbyshire, into a household where politics wasn't a hobby. It was the air you breathed. Her father, Frank Castle, was a tax inspector and a committed socialist. Her mother, Annie, carried the same fire. In their home, arguments weren't avoided, they were sharpened. The young Barbara learned early that words could be weapons, and that silence was a kind of surrender. She grew up in a Britain still stiff with class lines, where the future of a working and lower-middle-class girl was supposed to be modest. A job, a marriage, a quiet life. But Barbara's mind refused to stay in the box. At school, she was bright, competitive, and already allergic to being patronized. She read, she listened, she watched the rituals of authority, and she noticed something that would haunt her for decades. The people who made the rules rarely looked like the people who suffered under them. When she won a place at Oxford, St. Hugh's College, she arrived in the early 1930s, a time when the world felt like it was cracking. The Great Depression had turned hunger into a political fact. In Europe, fascism was no longer a rumor. It was marching in uniform. Oxford, with its gowns and traditions, could feel like a museum pretending history wasn't happening. Barbara didn't pretend. She threw herself into debate, into student politics, into the labor movement. She was not the kind of woman who waited to be invited to speak. She spoke first, and dared anyone to stop her. Her talent was obvious. Quick intelligence, a voice that could cut through noise, and a moral certainty that made compromise feel like cowardice. But that certainty came with a price. Even among allies, she could be seen as difficult. Men who admired her arguments still flinched at her confidence. She was learning the first rule of power. If you are a woman and you are brilliant, people will call you abrasive. If you are a man and you are brilliant, they will call you formidable. After Oxford, she stepped into journalism, joining the Daily Mirror in 1937. It was a paper with mass reach, and she understood instinctively what many politicians never do. If you can't speak to ordinary people, you don't deserve to lead them. She wrote with clarity and bite, covering social issues and politics with a reporter's eye for detail and a campaigner's hunger for change. Journalism also taught her something else: how to survive in rooms where men assumed you were decoration. She learned to ask the question that made them uncomfortable, then hold the silence until they answered. Then came war. Britain in 1939 was a nation bracing itself, and Barbara's life, like everyone's, was pulled into the gravity of conflict. She worked as a journalist through the Blitz era, when London nights were split open by sirens and fire. The war did not soften her. It hardened her sense of urgency. If the state could mobilize entire industries overnight, if it could ration, plan, and command for survival, then why, she would later ask, couldn't it mobilize with the same force to end poverty, to protect workers, to build a fairer society? In 1944, she married Ted Castle, a fellow socialist and journalist. It was a partnership of politics as much as affection. Two people who believed the world could be redesigned and who were willing to be unpopular for saying so. But even in marriage, Barbara Castle was never going to be a supporting character. She wanted the arena where decisions were made. She wanted Parliament. The problem was that Parliament did not want her. In the mid-1940s, the Labour Party was rising toward its post-war victory, but the political world remained overwhelmingly male. Women MPs existed, but they were rare, and often expected to behave like polite exceptions. Barbara was not polite. She was not an exception. She was a challenge. She stood for election in 1945 in the constituency of Reigate, an unwinnable seat for Labour, a place where the conservative grip was tight and tradition ran deep. She lost, as expected. But she didn't disappear. She treated defeat like reconnaissance. She tried again in 1950, this time in Blackburn East. Again she lost. 2 defeats could have been enough to convince a sensible person to choose an easier life. But Barbara Castle was not built for easy. She was built for pressure, and she was learning something crucial. Politics is not just about being right. It is about enduring long enough to win. In 1951, she finally broke through, elected as Labour MP for Blackburn East. She arrived at Westminster at a moment of bitter transition. Labour had just lost power, and the Conservatives were returning. The post-war dream of a new Britain was already being contested, trimmed, and argued over. For a new MP, it was a harsh environment, especially for a woman with a sharp tongue and no interest in deference. Westminster in the early 1950s could feel like a private club with public consequences. The rituals were ancient, the corridors thick with hierarchy. Barbara Castle walked into that world and refused to shrink. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent her life preparing for this fight. She was not there to be liked. She was there to be effective. Her early years in Parliament were a test of stamina. She had to master procedure, survive the social snobbery, and carve out a reputation in a party that could be both supportive and suspicious. Labour valued talent, but it also valued loyalty and discipline. Barbara's independence made her powerful and dangerous. She was the kind of MP who could electrify a room, but also the kind who could embarrass her own side if she thought they were drifting into cowardice. She became known for her work on social justice and for her ability to communicate beyond Westminster. She understood that politics was theater, but she refused to let it become pantomime. Her speeches were not gentle. They were built like arguments in a courtroom. Evidence, logic, moral force. She could make an opponent look ridiculous without raising her voice, and she could make her own front bench uncomfortable by asking the question they wanted to avoid. The 1950s were years of conservative dominance, and for Labour they were years of internal struggle, about direction, about identity, about whether to soften or sharpen. Barbara Castle was not interested in softening. She watched working people squeezed by economic shifts, watched women still treated as secondary citizens, watched the old class system adapt rather than die. And she felt the pressure of time in a way that was almost physical. She had seen the world slide toward catastrophe once already. She did not believe history waited politely. Outside Parliament, Britain was changing. Television was beginning to reshape public life. Consumer culture was rising. But beneath the surface, old injustices remained stubborn. Barbara Castle's politics were rooted in the belief that progress was not automatic. It had to be forced. Through law, through pressure, through confrontation if necessary. And confrontation was coming. Because the deeper she moved into national politics, the clearer the real conflict became. It wasn't just Conservatives versus Labour. It was Barbara Castle versus a system that expected women to be grateful for crumbs. A system that tolerated female MPs only if they were quiet. A system that treated trade unions as both necessary and suspect. A system that could praise fairness in speeches while protecting privilege in practice. She was building a reputation that would later make her indispensable and make her enemies. Men in suits would smile at her in corridors, then dismiss her as emotional when she spoke with passion. Journalists would describe her as fiery, in a way they rarely did for men. Allies would privately admit she was brilliant, then publicly keep her at arm's length when her brilliance threatened their comfort. But Barbara Castle had a gift for turning contempt into fuel. By the late 1950s, she was no longer just a backbencher with a sharp voice. She was a rising figure. Someone who could connect policy to people. Someone who could make the moral case for change in language that landed like a punch. She was also learning the cost of that role. The loneliness of being the person who says what others are thinking, but are too cautious to say aloud. And then, in 1959, she faced another blow. Constituency boundaries changed, and she lost her seat. Just like that, out. The Commons' doors that had finally opened were slammed again. For many politicians, losing a seat is a kind of death. It ends careers, breaks confidence, forces reinvention. For Barbara Castle, it was a countdown. Not because she was finished, but because she knew something most people avoid admitting. Political opportunity is not infinite. You don't get endless chances. You don't get unlimited time. She did not retreat into bitterness. She did what she always did. She fought for a way back in. She stood in a by-election in 1960 for Blackburn North and won, returning to Parliament with a sharper edge and a clearer sense of what survival required. She had been thrown out by the mechanics of the system, and she had forced her way back in through the will of voters. It was a warning shot to anyone who thought she could be quietly removed. Now she was back, and the 1960s were approaching like a storm front. Britain was on the verge of cultural upheaval, economic tension, and political realignment. Labour was searching for a path back to power, and Barbara Castle, battle-tested, publicly known, privately underestimated, was moving toward the center of the national stage. The establishment still saw her as a problem. They were right, because Barbara Castle wasn't preparing to fit into the system. She was preparing to make the system fit the people it had ignored for far too long. The 1960s didn't arrive politely. They arrived like a door kicked in. youth culture exploding on television screens, old certainties cracking, and Britain's economy wobbling under the weight of promises it could no longer easily keep. And inside Westminster, where tradition moved at the speed of dust, Barbara Castle was moving like a lit match in a room full of dry paper. She had fought her way back into Parliament in 1960, but she didn't return as a grateful survivor. She returned as someone who had seen the trapdoor open beneath her once, and who now refused to stand anywhere near it again. The men who ran the party could sense it. She wasn't just ambitious, she was impatient. And impatience, in British politics, is treated like a character flaw, unless you're a man. In opposition, Castle became one of Labour's most recognizable voices, sharp, media-ready, and impossible to ignore. Television was changing politics, and she understood the new rules instinctively. If you could speak plainly, if you could make policy, feel like a human story, you could reach beyond the Commons chamber and into living rooms. That terrified some of her colleagues. A woman who could out-argue them in Parliament was one thing. A woman who could outperform them on camera was another. Harold Wilson, Labour's leader, was a modernizer with a talent for managing factions. He also had a talent for spotting who could win fights for him. Castle was a fighter, but she wasn't tame. She didn't do loyalty as theater. She did it as a contract. Give me the chance to change things, and I'll deliver. Try to muzzle me, and I'll bite through the gag. When Labour finally clawed its way back toward power, the country was restless. The Conservatives had been in charge for most of the post-war period, and the shine was wearing off. Britain was still living with class divisions that felt medieval, with workplaces that could chew people up, with women expected to be grateful for the right to exist in public. The mood was shifting, fast, and Labour promised a new kind of Britain, planned, fairer, more rational, more humane. In October 1964, Labour won, barely. A majority so thin it felt like a tightrope. One wrong step and the government would fall. And suddenly Barbara Castle wasn't just a voice. She was inside the machine. Wilson made her Minister of Overseas Development. It sounded to some like a polite posting. Important, yes, but safely distant from the domestic battles where reputations were made and destroyed. Castle didn't treat it as distant. She treated it as moral. She pushed for aid that wasn't charity but justice, arguing that Britain's responsibilities didn't end at the White Cliffs of Dover. She traveled. She listened. She came back furious at complacency. In cabinet rooms, she spoke about hunger and inequality with the same intensity others reserved for exchange rates. But the real test of her power wasn't going to be overseas. It was going to be at home, where every reform had an enemy with a name, a newspaper, and a network. In 1966, Wilson called another election to strengthen his position. Labour won a much larger majority. The tightrope became a bridge, still dangerous but wide enough to run on. And Wilson moved Castle into a role that would put her directly in the path of Britain's most combustible forces. Minister of Transport. Transport sounds technical until you remember what it really is. Roads, deaths, unions, industry, money, and the daily life of millions. It's the bloodstream of a country. And in the mid-1960s, Britain's roads were killing people at a rate that now feels like a national trauma everyone had agreed not to talk about. Castle talked about it. She looked at the numbers, thousands dead, tens of thousands injured, and she treated them not as statistics, but as bodies. Families, empty chairs at kitchen tables. She pushed through measures that would become part of modern life. Seatbelts, breathalyzer tests to tackle drink driving, tougher rules on vehicle safety. These weren't popular with everyone. They were mocked as nanny state interference. Some papers sneered. Some MPs rolled their eyes. But Castle had a brutal clarity. Freedom to drive drunk wasn't freedom. It was permission to kill. The breathalyzer became a flashpoint. Pubs buzzed with outrage. Drivers complained about being treated like criminals. Police faced hostility. And Castle stood in the middle of it, taking the heat, because she could see what others refused to see. If the state could stop people dying and chose not to, that wasn't liberty. That was cowardice dressed up as principle. Then came the twist. Because the same woman being attacked as authoritarian for saving lives on the road was also pushing something. That sounded almost radical in its simplicity. Equal pay for women. In 1968, a strike erupted at the Ford plant in Dagenham. Women sewing machinists, skilled workers, were classified as unskilled and paid less than men. They walked out. It wasn't just a workplace dispute. It was a public exposure of a national hypocrisy. Britain liked to think of itself as modern. But here was a giant company, in a modern industry, treating women's labor as worth less by default. Castle stepped in. Not as a distant minister issuing statements, but as a negotiator willing to get her hands dirty. She met the women. She listened. She pushed Ford. She pushed unions. She pushed her own government. The settlement didn't deliver full equality overnight, but it cracked the wall. And Castle used that crack to force through something bigger, the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 would become one of her signature achievements. But the fight for it was ugly. There were colleagues who supported it in public and undermined it in private. There were men who smiled and said, "Of course," while quietly warning about costs, disruption, unrealistic expectations. Castle heard the subtext, "Know your place? Don't move too fast. Don't embarrass us." She moved faster. And while she was doing all this, while she was changing how Britain drove, how Britain paid women, how Britain thought about safety and fairness, another clock was ticking, one she didn't advertise. Castle's health was not a simple, stable thing. She had already lived with the knowledge that time and the body can become enemies. It gave her urgency that others mistook for temperament. She wasn't being dramatic, she was racing. By 1968, Wilson moved her again, this time into one of the most dangerous jobs in British politics. Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity. It was a title that sounded managerial. In reality, it meant walking into a war zone. Because Britain's industrial relations were breaking down, strikes were frequent. Unions were powerful, sometimes chaotic, sometimes heroic, sometimes self-defeating. Employers complained of paralysis. The public was exhausted. And the conservative opposition smelled blood. They wanted labor to look weak, captive to union leaders, incapable of governing. Castle was a labor woman with deep respect for working people and the union movement. But she was also a minister responsible for keeping the country functioning. That was her real conflict. Real, documented, and brutal. Barbara Castle versus the very forces labor depended on. Not a cartoon villain, not a simple betrayal, but a collision between loyalty and responsibility. She tried to solve it with a white paper that would become infamous, In Place of Strife. The title alone sounded like a challenge, and it was. Castle proposed reforms to reduce unofficial strikes and introduce cooling-off periods, ballots, and legal mechanisms to manage disputes. In her mind, it was a way to protect unions by making them sustainable, because she could see the future. If labor didn't reform industrial relations, the conservatives would do it later with a hammer. But the reaction was immediate and ferocious. Union leaders saw it as an attack. The labor left saw it as betrayal. Cabinet colleagues panicked. Wilson, the master balancer, began to wobble under the pressure. Castle found herself in the nightmare position of being right too early, pushing a reform that made enemies on all sides. And here's the cruelest part. She wasn't fighting conservatives in this battle. She was fighting her own side. Meetings turned poisonous. Promises were made and withdrawn. Drafts were softened. Support evaporated. Castle, who had spent her life refusing to be silenced, was now being asked to swallow her own policy for the sake of party unity. The same party that praised her courage when it was convenient now feared the consequences of letting her win. The showdown came in 1969. Under intense pressure, Wilson backed away from the full package. A compromise was reached with the unions. In Place of Strife was effectively gutted. For Castle, it was a political wound that never fully healed. Not because she loved confrontation for its own sake, but because she understood what had just happened. The government had blinked. And when a government blinks in a fight like that, everyone notices. Union leaders, employers, voters, and above all the opposition waiting to pounce. She didn't resign. She didn't stage a melodrama. She stayed and kept working, but something had changed. The myth of cabinet solidarity had been exposed as theater. The limits of her power, especially as a woman who didn't belong to the old boys' networks, had been made brutally clear. And yet, even in that apparent defeat, Castle had planted a warning in the middle of British politics. This problem will not go away. You can postpone it. You can bury it under compromise, but it will come back. Harder. By 1970, the government was tired. The public mood was shifting again. Economic pressures were tightening like a noose. Labour went to the country and lost. Edward Heath's Conservatives won, and Castle was back on the opposition benches. Again. But she wasn't the same woman who had entered government in 1964. She had been inside the engine room. She had passed laws that touched millions of lives. She had stared down industries, newspapers and cabinet rooms full of men who thought they could outlast her. She had also learned, in the most personal way possible, that power is not just about having the right ideas. Power is about whether your own side will let you use them. And as Britain slid into the turbulent 1970s, strikes, inflation, confrontation, Barbara Castle carried a dangerous knowledge. The battle she'd tried to fight and been stopped from winning was now becoming the battle the whole country would be forced to fight. The storm she'd warned about was no longer on the horizon. It was overhead. The storm didn't just arrive overhead. It broke. Loud, cold, and everywhere at once. In the early 1970s, Britain felt like a machine shaking itself apart. Inflation biting, wages chasing prices, strikes freezing whole, industries, and a public mood turning sour with the sense that nobody was in control. And for Barbara Castle, there was a cruel irony in watching it unfold from the opposition benches, because she had tried to build guardrails before the cliff edge, and her own side had ripped them out. Now the clock was running again. Not just the political clock, her clock. Castle had lived with the knowledge that the body can betray you without warning, that time is not a polite companion. It made her dangerous in a way Westminster didn't like. She didn't behave as if she had decades to wait for permission. Edward Heath's Conservative government walked straight into industrial confrontation and came out bruised. The miners' dispute, the three-day week, the sense of a country dimming its lights to survive, these weren't abstract headlines. They were the physical experience of national decline. Factories silent, homes cold, tempers short. Heath called an election in February 1974 on a question that sounded like a threat. Who governs Britain? And the country answered, not you. The result was a hung parliament. And suddenly Harold Wilson was back, forming a minority government that felt less like a victory and more like a rescue mission. Castle returned to office in March 1974 as Secretary of State for Social Services. It wasn't a glamorous department. It was the place where politics meets flesh. Hospitals, pensions, disability, sickness benefits, the quiet catastrophes that don't make speeches but ruin lives. And the timing was brutal. Britain was broke, the Treasury was anxious, and every promise came with a price tag that could topple the government. But Castle didn't see Social Security as a ledger. She saw it as a moral contract. She pushed through increases in benefits and pensions, fought for the poorest in cabinet arguments where affordability was often code for not our priority, and treated the welfare state not as charity but as citizenship. In a decade when politicians were starting to talk about the public as a burden, she insisted the state was a shield. Then came the first twist. The woman famous for taking on unions was now in a government that depended on them to survive. Wilson's strategy was to calm the industrial battlefield with a social contract, an understanding with the trade unions to restrain wage demands in exchange for social reforms. It was fragile, like balancing a glass of water on a moving train. Castle, with her memory of in place of strife, could see the danger. If the government lost control of pay, inflation would explode. If it tried to impose control, it would ignite rebellion. Either way, labor could be destroyed. In October 1974, Wilson called another election and won a narrow majority. Narrow, again. The tightrope returned. And in 1975, Wilson made his move. He shifted Castle to a job that sounded technical but was politically radioactive. Secretary of State for Prices and Consumer Protection. This was not a department for speeches. It was a department for fights. Prices were rising fast enough to make pay packets feel like melting ice. Housewives, still the people doing most of the shopping, were watching the cost of basics climb week by week. Anger was becoming domestic, intimate. The humiliation of counting coins at the till, the dread of the next bill. Castle understood something many politicians missed. Inflation isn't just economics, it's fear. So she went after it with the tools she had. She pushed price controls, challenged profiteering, and tried to make the government look like it was on the side of ordinary consumers, rather than distant markets. She became, in effect, the public face of the fight against rising prices, standing between families and the invisible forces emptying their pockets. And that made her a target. Business groups complained she was strangling enterprise. Newspapers mocked her as meddling, as if protecting people from being fleeced was a personal quirk. Some colleagues treated her department like a sideshow, a place to park a minister who made too much noise. Castle didn't accept that. She turned it into a stage and used it to talk directly to the country, because she knew the real battle wasn't only in cabinet, It was in public trust. If people believed politics was helpless, they would stop listening. And if they stopped listening, the loudest, simplest voices would win. Then, in 1976, the second twist hit. Harold Wilson resigned suddenly. No long goodbye, no gradual handover, just an abrupt exit that left Labour scrambling. James Callaghan took over, and the atmosphere changed. Wilson had been a manager of factions. Callaghan was a survivor of storms. He valued stability, caution, and deals that kept the ship afloat. Castle valued urgency. She could feel the gap widening. The country's finances were deteriorating. Sterling was under pressure. The government went to the International Monetary Fund in 1976, and the word IMF landed like a slap. It sounded like national humiliation, like Britain being put on financial probation. The price of the loan was spending restraint, austerity, before the word became fashionable again. For Castle, whose politics were built on the idea that the state exists to protect the vulnerable, it was a nightmare scenario. The very people who needed government most would be asked to pay for the crisis. Inside cabinet, arguments sharpened. Castle was not alone in resisting cuts, but she was one of the clearest voices. She had spent her career insisting that ordinary people were not a rhetorical device. Now she watched as the language of necessity began to override the language of justice, and she could see, with a kind of dread, how this would look outside Westminster. Labour, the party of working people, telling working people to tighten their belts while prices rose and jobs disappeared. The tension wasn't just ideological, it was personal, and it was real. Castle versus the gravitational pull of a government trying to survive by shrinking its ambitions. She had fought systems before, patriarchy, complacency, corporate power, but this was different. This was her own party. Again, choosing caution over confrontation. Again, the same pattern. She pushed. The room flinched. And then came the moment that made her feel the walls closing in. In 1976, Callaghan moved her out of the cabinet, not with a dramatic public execution. British politics rarely does that. It was done with the quiet efficiency of a door being closed. One day you're in the room where decisions are made. The next you're outside, hearing the muffled sound of them. For Castle, it wasn't just a demotion. It was a message. Your kind of politics is becoming inconvenient. But she didn't disappear. She did what she had always done when power tried to sideline her. She spoke louder. She wrote, she argued, she warned. She watched the government drift toward pay restraint and spending cuts, and she watched the unions, Labour's base, Labour's muscle, grow angrier. The social contract frayed, trust eroded. And the country, already exhausted, began to feel like it was being asked to endure pain without purpose. By 1978 and 1979, the pressure finally burst into what would be remembered as the winter of discontent. Strikes spread. Public services were disrupted. The images were stark and unforgettable. Rubbish piling in streets, the sense of a society clogged and rotting, the feeling that the state itself was failing. It wasn't a simple morality play. Workers had real grievances, wages had been squeezed, inflation had punished them. But politics doesn't reward complexity. Politics rewards whoever can turn chaos into a story. And Margaret Thatcher was waiting with a story. Castle watched the narrative harden. Labour equals disorder. Unions equal menace. The state equals incompetence. She had spent years trying to modernize Britain without breaking its people. Now she saw the country preparing to swing toward a different kind of modernization, one that would break people and call it efficiency. In 1979, Labour lost. Thatcher won. And the shift wasn't just electoral. It was cultural. A new era arrived with a new tone. Harder, colder, more certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't ask permission. For Castle, the defeat carried a bitter echo. She had warned, a decade earlier, that if Labour didn't reform industrial relations, the Conservatives would do it later with a hammer. Now she could almost hear the hammer being lifted. And here's the final sting of this act. Castle's greatest achievements: road safety, equal pay, the idea that government can intervene to save lives and correct injustice, were now being reframed by her opponents as examples of the very nanny state they wanted to dismantle. The same reforms that had made Britain safer and fairer were being used as evidence that the state had grown too bold. She remained in Parliament, but the ground under her politics was shifting. The party she had fought for was changing too, pulled between loyalty to its roots and fear of being blamed for the chaos of the 1970s. Castle, never a natural conformist, found herself increasingly out of step with the direction of travel. And still, the time limit hovered. Not as a melodramatic countdown, but as a private pressure. The sense that you don't get infinite chances to force history to move. She had already seen what happens when you hesitate. How quickly the moment passes, how ruthlessly it closes. As the 1980s began, Barbara Castle was no longer the minister with the red box and the power to sign change into law. But she was something else, something that can be even more dangerous to those in charge. A witness with a memory, a politician who could point at the present and say, with unnerving precision, "I told you this would happen." And Britain, stepping into the Thatcher years, was about to discover just how expensive it is to ignore a warning. The new decade didn't begin with a bang, it began with a chill. One election night in 1979, Barbara Castle watched the country pivot, hard, into the Thatcher years, and she understood something before many of her colleagues dared to say it out loud. This wasn't just a change of government. It was a change of weather. The air itself felt different. The language turned sharper. Compassion was recast as weakness. Regulation became a punchline. Trade unions, once treated as partners or problems to be managed, were now framed as enemies to be crushed. And Castle, who had spent her life believing the state could be a shield, was suddenly living in a Britain where the shield was being called a cage. She stayed on the labor benches, but the fight had moved. In the 1960s and 70s, her battles had been inside cabinet rooms, across negotiating tables, in the machinery of law. Now the battlefield was memory and meaning. What the last 30 years had been for, what labor stood for, what progress even meant. She had been a minister who made things happen. Now she was a voice trying to stop the story of her own era being rewritten as a national mistake. The pressure wasn't only political, it was personal, and it was physical. Castle had never treated her body as something to consult before a confrontation. But time, her oldest opponent, was no longer an abstract idea. It was a sensation, a tightening, a fatigue that arrived earlier than it used to, a reminder that the clock doesn't care about your principles. And yet she refused to become a museum piece. In Parliament through the early 1980s, she kept pushing, kept speaking, kept warning about what would happen when unemployment was treated as collateral damage and communities were treated as expendable. She watched the numbers climb, joblessness rising into the millions, and she watched the human consequences spread like damp through a house. Marriages strained, health collapsing, young people learning hopelessness as a normal condition. She had fought for equal pay and safer roads. Now she was watching a different kind of danger become normal. The danger of a society, deciding that some people simply don't matter. Labor, meanwhile, was tearing itself open. The party was split between those who wanted to fight Thatcherism with a harder left program and those who feared the electorate would never forgive another decade of turmoil. The arguments weren't polite. They were existential. And Castle, who had never been afraid of a fight, found herself in a strange position. She was a figure of the labor left, but also a pragmatist who had spent years inside government trying to make reforms real. She knew what it cost to win power, and what it cost to lose it. Then came a twist that would have sounded impossible to the young Barbara Castle, who had once been dismissed as too much for Westminster. She was offered a different kind of platform, not in the Commons, but in Europe. In 1984, after nearly 4 decades as an MP, she left the House of Commons and became a member of the European Parliament. For some, it looked like retirement by relocation. For Castle, it was another front line. Europe wasn't a quiet backwater. It was becoming a place where rules were written that would shape workers' rights, consumer protections, even the balance between markets and people. She had spent her life trying to civilize capitalism with law. Now she was stepping into an arena where that struggle was being fought across borders, and she arrived with a reputation that preceded her like thunder. In Strasbourg and Brussels, she threw herself into the work with the same impatience for delay that had made her famous and infamous at home. She argued for social protections, for women's rights, for the idea that economic integration without human safeguards was a machine built to grind the weak. She was not starry-eyed about European institutions. She could smell bureaucracy from a mile away. But she also understood something that would become painfully clear later. If decisions were going to be made above the nation-state, and then the fight for fairness had to go there too, or it would be lost by default. Still, the clock kept ticking. By the late 1980s, her health was no longer something she could outstare. The body that had carried her through campaigns, late-night debates, and ministerial crises began to demand payment. She stepped down from the European Parliament in 1989. The public might have read it as a graceful exit. Those close to her knew it was also necessity. The time limit was tightening. But Castle had never believed that leaving office meant leaving the fight. She wrote, she spoke, she appeared. She became, in a way, a living archive of a labor tradition that was being pushed aside by the new political climate. And she did it with a sharpness that made it impossible to treat her as a harmless elder. Even out of power, she could still make people uncomfortable, because she could still name what was happening. And then, in 1990, another turn. Margaret Thatcher fell, not defeated by the electorate but toppled by her own party. The Iron Lady, the symbol of certainty, brought down by internal revolt. For Castle, it was proof of something she had always believed. No political force is invincible, not even one that seems to have rewritten the rules. But the fall didn't reverse the era. Thatcherism had already seeped into the assumptions of public life. It had changed what politicians thought they were allowed to say, and what the public had been trained to expect. Castle watched Labour struggle with that inheritance. The party was modernizing, rebranding, trying to become electable again in a country that had been taught to distrust the very idea of collective solutions. She understood the need to win. She also feared what would be traded away in the process. And here the conflict sharpened into something almost tragic. Barbara Castle versus the drift of history. Because the reforms she had fought for, equal pay, workplace protections, the welfare state as a moral contract, were no longer universally treated as obvious goods. They were being questioned, trimmed, reframed as luxuries. Even when they survived, they were defended in a different language. Not justice, but efficiency. Not solidarity, but value for money. Castle had never been sentimental about politics, but she was fiercely loyal to the idea that the point of power is to protect people who can't protect themselves. Watching that idea become unfashionable was like watching a beloved building quietly dismantled brick by brick. Yet she also saw something else. Her victories had become so embedded that many people forgot they had ever been victories at all. Equal pay legislation didn't erase inequality, but it changed the legal and moral landscape. The breathalyzer didn't end drink driving, but it made it socially and legally indefensible in a way it hadn't been before. Seatbelts didn't stop crashes, but they stopped bodies from becoming projectiles. These weren't abstract achievements. They were saved lives, saved futures. Millions of ordinary moments that never became tragedies because a law existed. That is the strange fate of successful reform. When it works, it disappears into normality. In 1990, she was made a life peer and entered the House of Lords as Baroness Castle of Blackburn. To some, it sounded like establishment recognition. To Castle, it was another place to speak from. Another chamber where she could press, prod, and refuse to be quiet. She took her seat not as a trophy but as a tool, and she kept going, even as the body insisted otherwise. The 1990s brought a new Britain, the end of the Cold War, the rise of global finance, the acceleration of media politics. Labour, under Tony Blair, moved toward the center and finally won in 1997. For many of Castle's generation, it was a moment of relief. After 18 years in the wilderness, Labour was back. For Castle, it was complicated. She wanted the party to govern. She also wanted it to remember what governing was for. She didn't live in a fantasy of the past. She knew the old Labour model had cracked under the pressures of the 1970s. But she also knew that a party can win elections and still lose its soul by degrees, quietly, in the name of realism. She had heard that word too many times used as a weapon against the vulnerable. And then, as the century turned, the time limit became undeniable. Age narrowed her world. The public appearances became rarer. The voice that had once cut through rooms began to fade from the daily noise of politics. But her presence remained like a stubborn landmark. People still argued about her. That alone was a kind of victory. Politicians who are truly irrelevant are not debated. They are forgotten. Castle was not forgotten. When she died on the 3rd May 2002, the obituaries tried to compress her into a neat shape. Fiery, controversial, trailblazer. Those words were true, but they were also too small. They didn't capture the texture of what it meant to be a woman in mid-century British politics who refused to behave like a guest. They didn't capture the loneliness of being right too early, or the cost of pushing reforms that make enemies in your own camp. They didn't capture the way she could be both adored and resented, sometimes by the same people, because she demanded more than they wanted to give. If you want the real measure of Barbara Castle, don't look first at the portraits or the titles. Look at the ordinary scenes. A woman opening her payslip and knowing the law is on her side. A driver clicking a seatbelt without thinking. A family getting home safely because someone else didn't dare drink and drive. A worker reading a contract with rights written into it. A pensioner whose income rises not because of charity, but because citizenship means something. These are not cinematic moments. They don't look like history being made, but they are the point. And there is one more twist. Quiet, but devastating in its own way. Castle spent much of her life being told she was too forceful, too loud, too uncompromising. Yet the Britain that followed her proved the necessity of exactly that kind of politics. Because when the state retreats, it doesn't leave a neutral space behind. Something fills the gap. Private power, inequality, luck, inheritance. The strong do not become kinder when rules are removed. They become freer. Barbara Castle understood that early. She understood it in the mills and streets of industrial Britain, in the male-dominated corridors of Westminster, in the cabinet battles, where "we can't" was often just "we won't." She understood it when she was pushed out, when her own party flinched, when the country turned away from her kind of reform, and she kept saying it anyway, because she didn't have the luxury of pretending time was endless. That was her real deadline. Not the end of a career, not the end of a government, not even the end of a life, but the moment when a society decides what it will tolerate. Barbara Castle spent her years trying to move that moment, to drag it toward decency by force of will and law. And long after the arguments of her day have faded, the consequences of her victories still hold, quietly, invisibly, like a hand on your shoulder, keeping you from falling.